One of the most perplexing moments in the entire history of religious thought is not a tragic death, but a profoundly paradoxical departure. Humanity has long been conditioned to understand endings through death, a clear conclusion, a definitive full stop. Yet here, what continues to unsettle and provoke reflection is the opposite. A man who conquered death, who returned to life, who demonstrated ultimate victory, chose to leave. Not to vanish in mystery, not to withdraw quietly, but to depart openly before the very eyes of those closest to him. This is the account of Jesus Christ, and the question that has echoed across centuries remains: why leave at the moment of victory? If you are drawn to deeper explorations of biblical narratives, faith-based reflection, and intellectually grounded spiritual insights, consider subscribing and following the channel. This journey is not merely about understanding a story, it is about understanding the deeper structures of belief, doubt, and human experience. Following the resurrection, instead of immediately concluding his mission, Jesus remained for 40 days. Yet this was no longer the same kind of presence. The crowds were gone, the public miracles had ceased. In their place were quiet, intimate encounters, moments that were often ambiguous, even disorienting. At times, he appeared suddenly, only to disappear just as unexpectedly. At other times, he stood among his followers, yet they failed to recognize him. His presence seemed to exist in a liminal space, both within reality and somehow beyond it. This ambiguity created a unique psychological tension among the disciples. They were unable to fully believe, yet equally unable to deny what they were witnessing. They had seen him crucified. They had witnessed death in its most final form. And now they were confronted with his living presence. How could these two irreconcilable realities coexist? Faith and doubt began to operate simultaneously within them. There were moments of overwhelming joy, quickly followed by fear and hesitation. Notably, those who had been closest to him, those who knew him best, were the slowest to believe. This does not weaken the narrative, rather, it strengthens its realism. Because faith, in its deepest sense, is not the automatic result of seeing, it is the process of wrestling with what one has seen. During these 40 days, Jesus was not merely proving that he was alive, he was preparing them for something far greater. His teachings shifted in tone and purpose. They were no longer simply moral instructions, but directional frameworks for a new phase of existence. He spoke of a kingdom unlike any earthly system. He spoke of a power that would come, not through force or political authority, but from above. And most significantly, he spoke of a mission that extended beyond all geographical boundaries, a calling that would require them to move forward without him in the way they once had. Yet even as they heard these words, understanding did not come easily. Beneath everything remained a deeply human question. Where is this leading? They had witnessed the extraordinary, but the trajectory of the story remained unclear. And perhaps what they did not anticipate was that the story would not conclude in any conventional sense. The unusual nature of Jesus' presence during this post-resurrection period was not incidental, it was intentional. It functioned as a form of transformation. He did not overwhelm them with undeniable proof that would eliminate all doubt. Instead, he allowed space for uncertainty, forcing them to confront their own internal foundations. Were they believing because they saw, or because they had come to understand? In that tension, a new kind of faith began to emerge, not one rooted in certainty, but in conscious choice. Fear also played a significant role during this period. The disciples were not only afraid of what they did not understand, but also of what they might be called to become. If this event was real, if death itself had been overcome, then everything they thought they knew about reality required re-evaluation. And such a shift is never comfortable. It demands the abandonment of familiar structures and the courage to step into an unknown future, one in which they would no longer be directly guided, but would have to act independently. And yet, alongside doubt and fear, there remained something that could not be extinguished: hope. It was not fully defined, nor was it anchored in clear answers, but it was sufficient to keep them present, to keep them listening, to keep them waiting. This hope became the foundation upon which everything else would be built. In retrospect, these 40 days were not a secondary detail in the narrative. They were a critical transitional phase. They marked the shift from following to becoming. From individuals who relied on the physical presence of a teacher, the disciples were being reshaped into carriers of a mission, and for that transformation to occur, they had to pass through this internal conflict, where belief was no longer automatic, but intentional. It is within this tension, between seeing and not seeing, between belief and doubt, between fear and hope, that something fundamentally new was formed. A foundation not dependent on visible presence, but on something deeper, something that only emerges when external certainty is removed, and a person is left with no choice but to look inward and decide what they truly believe. As those 40 days drew quietly toward their conclusion, something began to shift, subtly at first, almost imperceptibly, yet undeniably present. The encounters were becoming fewer, the silences longer, and the weight of each word heavier. What had once felt like a continuation of something familiar was now taking on the character of a transition. The disciples may not have fully understood it, but they could sense it. This phase was not meant to last. There was no formal announcement that this would be the final meeting, no clear signal that what was about to happen would mark a definitive turning point. It appeared, on the surface, to be just another gathering, another moment in a sequence of moments that had already defied explanation. Yet the atmosphere was different. There was a stillness, a density to the silence, as if something unspoken was pressing in on all sides. The words that followed were not more complex than before, but they carried a finality that had not been present in earlier conversations. Jesus Christ spoke not in abstractions, but with clarity. He told them that they would receive power, not from themselves, not from any earthly system, but from above. He told them they would become witnesses, not just in the places they knew, but extending outward to the very edges of the world. This was no longer instruction, it was commissioning. What had once been a relationship defined by proximity was now being redefined by responsibility. And yet, even in that moment, there is no indication that the disciples fully grasped what was unfolding. How could they? Everything about their experience had already exceeded the limits of expectation. They had followed, they had failed, they had fled, they had returned, they had doubted, and now they stood once again in his presence, listening, trying to hold on to every word, while something deeper was already moving beyond their understanding. Then, without spectacle, without disruption, it began. There was no thunder, no dramatic rupture in the sky. The moment did not announce itself with overwhelming force. Instead, it unfolded with a kind of quiet inevitability. Jesus Christ began to ascend, not abruptly, not violently, but gradually. At first, it may have seemed like a trick of perception, a misinterpretation of movement. But as the distance between him and the ground increased, uncertainty gave way to realization. The disciples did not react with chaos. No one rushed forward. No one cried out in confusion. Instead, they stood still, completely still, as if movement itself had become impossible. Their eyes followed him upward, fixed on the one point in reality that no longer obeyed the rules they had always known. Time, in that moment, seemed to stretch. Each second carried the weight of something irreversible. The light began to shift, not in a blinding or destructive way, but in a manner that felt both natural and otherworldly. It was not merely the light of the sun. It seemed to carry a different quality, something fuller, something that suggested depth rather than brightness. The air itself felt altered. A gentle movement, like a quiet wind, passed through, not enough to disturb, but enough to signal that the environment itself was responding. He continued to rise, steadily, undeniably. The space between them grew wider, yet their focus did not break. No one looked away. It was as if to blink would be to risk losing something that could never be recovered. This was not simply a moment they were witnessing. It was a boundary they were crossing, whether they understood it or not. Then came the cloud. Not an ordinary formation drifting across the sky, but something that seemed to arrive with intention, positioned precisely at the intersection between what could still be seen and what was about to disappear. It did not obscure instantly. Instead, it received him gradually, as though drawing a curtain across a stage at the exact moment the scene reached its conclusion. And then, he was gone. Not abruptly, not violently, but completely. What followed was not immediate understanding, but silence. The disciples remained where they were. No one spoke. No one moved. Their eyes stayed fixed on the empty space where he had just been, as if expectation itself could reverse what had occurred. Perhaps some of them believed he might reappear. Perhaps others were simply unable to process the finality of what they had just witnessed. The sky had returned to its ordinary state, the ground beneath them unchanged, and yet nothing, absolutely nothing, felt the same. This was not the kind of event that could be categorized easily. It was not a miracle meant to provoke awe, nor a demonstration designed to convince. It functioned more like a transfer, a moment in which something was taken away in order for something else to begin. The presence they had depended on was no longer available in the same way. The voice they had followed, the figure they had walked beside, the teacher they had questioned, was no longer physically there. And that absence changed everything. Up until that point, their identity had been defined by following. Their decisions had been shaped by proximity. Their understanding had been formed through direct interaction. Now, all of that was gone. What remained were words, memories, and something less tangible but far more demanding: responsibility. In that moment, though they may not have articulated it, they crossed a threshold. The question was no longer, what will he do next? But, what will we do now? The direction of the narrative had shifted from external guidance to internal conviction. They were no longer observers of an unfolding story. They had become participants in its continuation. And yet, even as this realization began to take shape, it was not accompanied by clarity. There were no immediate answers, no structured plan, no detailed roadmap. Only the echo of his words and the reality of his absence. They were standing between what had been and what had not yet begun, suspended in a moment that demanded movement but offered no visible path. This is what made the Ascension so profoundly unsettling, and at the same time, so necessary. If he had remained, they might have continued as they always had, looking outward, waiting for instruction, relying on presence. But in leaving, he forced a reorientation. Faith could no longer depend on sight. Action could no longer be delayed by uncertainty. The transition was not just physical, it was existential. The victory over death had already been achieved. But the continuation of that victory, its meaning, its reach, its impact, would now depend on those who had witnessed it. Not because they fully understood it, but precisely because they did not. They were being asked to move forward, not with complete knowledge, but with enough conviction to take the next step. And so they stood there, in the silence that followed the impossible, at the edge of a new reality, no longer defined by what they could see, but by what they would choose to believe and become. What followed that moment of stillness was not an immediate surge of clarity, but something far more subtle and far more demanding. The disciples remained where they were, their gaze still fixed upward, as if the act of looking might somehow restore what had just been taken from them. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the nature of that moment began to change. What had started as awe was giving way to realization, and that realization carried with it a weight they had not yet fully anticipated. Until now, their identity had been defined by proximity. They followed, they listened, they responded. Their role was reactive, shaped by the presence of Jesus Christ. But in his absence, something fundamental shifted. There was no longer a physical figure to walk behind, no voice to immediately consult, no visible presence to confirm their direction. The structure that had sustained them was gone, and in its place, something far less comfortable emerged: responsibility. This was the true turning point, not the ascension itself, but what it required of those who remained. They were no longer followers in the traditional sense. They could not remain in a posture of waiting, of observing, of depending. They were being moved, whether they felt ready or not, into a new mode of existence, one in which they would have to act without certainty, speak without immediate validation, and move forward without visible assurance. To follow is, in many ways, to be relieved of ultimate responsibility. The path is defined by another. The decisions are guided externally. But to walk on one's own is something entirely different. It demands internal conviction. It requires the ability to act in the absence of confirmation. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it forces a person to confront the possibility of being wrong and to move forward anyway. The disciples, standing in that suspended moment, were beginning to cross that boundary. They may not have had the language for it, but the shift was already underway. Their gaze, still fixed on the sky, reflected a natural human instinct: to hold on to what was known, to delay the necessity of moving forward. As long as they were looking upward, they could postpone the implications of what had just occurred. And it is precisely at this point that the next interruption takes place. Two figures appeared among them, suddenly, without announcement, without any visible approach. There were no footsteps, no sound to signal their arrival. Yet their presence was unmistakable. The atmosphere, already heavy with silence, seemed to deepen further. The disciples, already disoriented, now found themselves confronted with something else they could not easily explain. These figures did not begin with accusation, nor did they express surprise at the disciples' confusion. Instead, they posed a question, simple in structure, yet profound in implication. Why do you stand looking into the sky? At first glance, it may seem like an obvious observation. Of course they were looking upward. Where else would they look after witnessing such an event? But the question was not about direction. It was about orientation. It was not addressing their eyes, but their state of mind. Why remain fixed on what has already departed? Why anchor your attention to a moment that, by its very nature, cannot be reversed? The question functioned as a disruption, an intentional break in their psychological inertia. It called them out of passive observation and into active awareness. Before they could respond, before they could even fully process the question, the message continued. This same Jesus, who has been taken from you into heaven, will come back in the same way you have seen him go. With that statement, the entire framework of the moment shifted once again. What had felt like an ending was redefined as a pause. What had seemed like absence was reframed as transition. And what had been experienced as loss was now placed within the context of promise. But this promise came with no timeline, no conditions, no measurable indicators. It did not offer control. It did not provide certainty in the way human expectations often demand. Instead, it introduced something far more complex, a future that must be lived toward without being fully understood. This is where the deeper theological significance begins to emerge. The ascension is not merely a physical departure, it is a transformation in the mode of presence. Up until that point, the relationship between the disciples and Jesus Christ had been mediated through visibility. They could see him, hear him, follow him. Their faith, while real, was supported by direct experience. But now, that framework was removed. The shift from visible to invisible presence is not a reduction, it is an expansion. A physical presence is by nature limited to a specific location, a specific time, a specific group of people. But an invisible presence, paradoxically, is not constrained in the same way. It cannot be localized, but neither can it be confined. It moves from being externally observed to internally encountered. This transition, however, comes at a cost. It requires a different kind of faith. Faith that depends on sight is, in many ways, incomplete. It is responsive rather than generative. It reacts to what is already evident. But faith that exists without sight operates differently. It is not built on immediate confirmation, but on sustained trust. It does not eliminate doubt, but learns to move through it. The disciples were now being called into that kind of faith. Not a faith that is constantly reinforced by visible signs, but one that must be maintained in their absence. And this is where maturity begins. Spiritual maturity is not the elimination of uncertainty. It is the ability to act meaningfully within it. It is the capacity to hold conviction without constant reassurance. It is the willingness to take responsibility for what one believes, rather than outsourcing that responsibility to external authority. This is perhaps the most demanding aspect of the transformation, because once the external guide is no longer visibly present, the question shifts inward. It is no longer, what am I told to believe, but what do I actually believe, and why? In this sense, the Ascension initiates a process of personalization. Faith is no longer collective in the same way. It is no longer sustained by shared proximity to a central figure. It becomes individualized, not in isolation, but in responsibility. Each person must now engage with the message directly, interpret it, live it, and carry it forward. The disciples, standing at that intersection between past experience and future responsibility, were being asked to do something profoundly difficult, to move forward without the conditions they had relied on, guided only by what had been entrusted to them. They would no longer walk behind him. They would have to walk because of him. And in that distinction lies the essence of the transformation, not just of their role, but of faith itself. As the immediate shock of that moment gradually gave way to reflection, the story did not dissolve into abstraction or remain confined to memory. Instead, it became anchored, paradoxically, in a physical place. Not as proof in the scientific sense, not as something that could definitively settle questions of belief, but as a point of contact between narrative and geography, between memory and space. That place is known as the Mount of Olives. Rising just east of Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives is not, in itself, overwhelming in scale or grandeur. It does not impose itself dramatically on the landscape. And yet, within the structure of this narrative, it carries a weight that far exceeds its physical dimensions. According to tradition, it is here that the Ascension took place, the final visible moment before Jesus Christ disappeared from human sight. Over time, this location has become more than a geographical marker. It has become a site of convergence, where history, faith, and personal reflection intersect. What is particularly striking is that the site itself does not attempt to dominate the experience. Unlike monumental religious architecture designed to overwhelm the senses, the structure associated with this event, the Chapel of the Ascension, is notably simple. It does not rely on grandeur to convey significance. There are no towering halls, no intricate displays meant to impress. Instead, there is restraint, a kind of architectural humility that seems almost intentional. This simplicity serves a function. It redirects attention. Rather than focusing on external spectacle, it invites inward reflection. Those who enter are not confronted with an argument, but with a space that holds a memory, but does not force an interpretation. In this way, the chapel becomes less of a monument and more of a threshold. It does not claim to prove what happened. It preserves the possibility that something did. At the center of this space lies perhaps the most curious element, a mark on the stone floor. traditionally identified as a footprint, the last point of contact before the ascension. From an empirical standpoint, such a claim cannot be verified with certainty. There is no scientific method capable of tracing that impression back to a specific moment in history in any definitive way. And yet, the persistence of this detail across centuries raises an important question. Why does it matter? The answer does not lie in evidence, but in meaning. The footprint functions symbolically rather than materially. It represents a boundary, the final intersection between the visible and the invisible, between presence and absence. It marks not just where someone stood, but where something ended and something else began. In that sense, its significance is not diminished by the lack of verification. It is amplified by the role it plays in the narrative structure of belief. People continue to come to this place, not because it resolves their questions, but because it holds them. Pilgrims from different cultures, languages, and backgrounds arrive, often carrying their own uncertainties, their own unresolved tensions. Some come in silence, others in visible emotion. But what unites them is not certainty. It is the willingness to engage with a story that refuses to be reduced to simple conclusions. And this is where the transition into the modern context becomes unavoidable. Because the deeper question is not whether the event can be historically confirmed in the way modern standards might demand. The deeper question is why a story like this continues to resonate in a world that is, in many ways, defined by entirely different concerns. Modern life is not lacking in information. If anything, it is saturated with it. Data is abundant. Explanations are readily available. Connectivity is constant. And yet, beneath this surface of access and immediacy, there exists a different kind of deficit, one that is less visible but far more consequential, a deficit of direction, a deficit of inner coherence, a deficit of peace. The contemporary individual often moves through a landscape of endless options without a clear sense of orientation. Decisions multiply, but clarity does not. External noise increases, but internal grounding weakens. The result is not simply confusion, but fragmentation, a sense that one is constantly in motion without truly arriving anywhere. In this context, the narrative of the Ascension takes on a different kind of relevance. It does not offer solutions in the conventional sense. It does not provide a step-by-step framework for resolving modern complexity. What it does instead is introduce a different kind of question, one that cuts beneath the surface of external circumstances and addresses the structure of internal experience. What do you do when the visible guide is no longer there? What sustains direction when certainty is removed? How does one continue forward when the path is not clearly defined? These are not ancient questions, they are deeply contemporary. The disciples standing on that mountain were confronted with a loss of immediate guidance. The figure they had relied on was no longer physically present. They were left with memory, instruction, and a promise, but no direct supervision. In many ways, this mirrors the modern condition more closely than one might initially assume. Today, individuals are rarely lacking in external input. Advice is abundant, systems are in place, frameworks exist, and yet there remains a persistent difficulty in translating all of that into meaningful direction. The issue is not access, it is integration. This is where the narrative begins to function less as a historical account and more as a reflective tool. It shifts attention inward. It disrupts the assumption that clarity must always come from outside. It suggests that the absence of visible guidance is not necessarily a deficiency, but a condition in which a different kind of awareness can emerge. The ascension, in this sense, is not simply about departure. It is about reorientation. It challenges the expectation that meaning is always externally delivered. It introduces the possibility that meaning must be actively engaged, interpreted, and lived. And in doing so, it places responsibility, not in a burdensome sense, but in an empowering one, back into the hands of the individual. This does not eliminate uncertainty, it does not resolve all tension, but it reframes them. Uncertainty becomes the space in which conviction is formed. Silence becomes the context in which deeper questions can be heard. Absence becomes the condition that reveals what has truly been internalized. And perhaps this is why the story continues to endure, not because it answers every question, but because it asks the right ones. Not because it provides closure, but because it opens a pathway for reflection that remains relevant across time. Standing at the intersection of an ancient mountain and a modern mind, the narrative does not demand agreement, it invites engagement. And in that invitation, it continues to do what it has always done, not resolve the tension between presence and absence, but transform it into a space where something deeper can begin. And so, as the narrative moves toward what might appear to be its conclusion, it becomes clear that it does not end in the way most stories do. There is no final resolution that neatly closes every question. There is no definitive explanation that removes all ambiguity. Instead, what remains is something far more demanding and far more personal. The final message is not delivered as a statement to be accepted, but as a reality to be lived. Faith, in this context, is no longer tied to sight. It is no longer dependent on visible confirmation or repeated proof. If the earlier stages of the story were built around witnessing, seeing, hearing, following, then this final stage shifts the entire framework. Faith is not about what is seen, but about what is sustained when nothing can be seen. This distinction is critical. To believe because one sees is, in many ways, natural. It requires little internal transformation. It aligns with instinct, with perception, with immediate validation. But to believe without seeing, to continue acting, choosing, and orienting one's life around something that is no longer visibly present, this requires a different kind of engagement. It requires decision. And that is where the narrative places its full weight, on the act of choosing. Faith is not presented here as a passive state, something one simply has or does not have. It is an active posture. It is something that must be enacted, not merely held. It is expressed through direction, through action, through the way one moves forward in the absence of certainty. To say that faith is lived rather than seen is to shift it from the realm of observation into the realm of responsibility. It is no longer about being convinced, it is about being committed. Not in the sense of blind adherence, but in the sense of alignment. Choosing, again and again, to orient one's life around what one has come to believe holds meaning, even when that meaning is not immediately reinforced. This is not an easy position to maintain. It does not eliminate doubt. It does not silence questions. In fact, it often intensifies them. But within that tension, something else becomes possible, something that cannot emerge in conditions of constant certainty, authenticity. Because when belief is no longer sustained by external visibility, it must be grounded internally. It must pass through reflection, through struggle, through reconsideration. It cannot remain superficial. It either deepens or it dissolves. And this is precisely where the story leaves its audience, not with an answer, but with a confrontation. Not a confrontation imposed from outside, but one that arises from within. If you had been there, standing on that mountain, watching the figure you had followed rise beyond your reach, hearing words that promised a return but offered no timeline, no visible assurance, what would you have done? Would you have remained looking upward, holding on to the last trace of what you could see? Would you have turned away, concluding that what cannot be explained cannot be trusted? Or would you have chosen to move forward, uncertain, unresolved, but willing to act as though what you had witnessed carried meaning beyond your full understanding? This question is not confined to that moment in history. It extends into the present, into every context where certainty is incomplete and direction is unclear. Because, in the end, The story does not ask whether the event can be proven in a way that satisfies every standard of evidence. It asks something far more direct. What do you do with what you cannot fully explain but cannot entirely dismiss? Faith, as presented here, is not the absence of doubt. It is the decision to move through doubt without allowing it to dictate inaction. It is the willingness to live as though meaning exists, even when it is not immediately visible. And so the narrative closes not with a conclusion, but with an opening. Not with certainty, but with a question that remains deliberately unresolved. If you had been there, what would you choose to believe?